Happy Wattle Day. That's right. How many of you realise that the 1st of September is Wattle Day? Considering all the contention regarding what Australia's national holiday should be, why not the 1st of September, the first day of spring? Wattle Day. Think about it. There's over 700 species of wattle which are indigenous to this continent. Now, as it's almost Wattle Day, or Wattle Day, if you're watching this on the 1st of September, I think what I'd like to look at today is the Australian Constitution, or the Constitution of Australia. Why the Constitution of Australia? Well, irrespective of whether you agree with it or not, irrespective of whether you're a First Nations person who's never ceded sovereignty and doesn't accept the Constitution, and irrespectively if you claim you're a sovereign citizen and the Constitution has nothing to do for you, the fact is the Constitution is the basis on which Australian laws are passed by Parliament. It is the 10 Commandments of secular Australia, but it doesn't have 10 sections, it's got 128 sections, but we'll look at that in a minute. So you need to understand that Australia is a federation of sovereign dominions, 6 sovereign dominions, under a constitutional monarchy. That's what Australia is, as far as the constitutional document is concerned. Now, a lot of people have the misconception that in Australia we have freedoms which are enshrined in law. The reality is, the Australian Constitution is basically a document which regulates the relationship between the states and the central government, the federal government. And most people don't seem to understand that. It's got nothing to do with rights. Let's look at the history. In 1889, because of increasing German and French colonial activity around the Australian continent, what we saw was a push from the 6 sovereign dominions which made up the territory on the Australian continent, started to talk about federation. And a federal council was established, but unfortunately the government of New South Wales wasn't interested, and that lapsed. The next year, the governor of New South Wales, or the Premier of New South Wales, organised a constitutional convention which was held in Melbourne in 1890, followed by another one in 1891 which was held in Sydney. Now, this convention basically was attended by premiers and business leaders. There was very little interest among Australians in the various dominions regarding these constitutional arrangements. So a plan was put in place to have a popular vote in the 6 states, the 6 sovereign dominions under the British monarchy, to elect representatives to attend a constitutional convention which spread between 1891 and 1897 to 1898. And during this convention, the Constitution, with some minor alterations which have been drawn up by political and business leaders in 1890 and 1891 was adopted. A minority faction wanted a Bill of Rights incorporated in the Australian Constitution, but this was defeated. The next step was the new Constitution was put to the electors in each of the 6 dominions: New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, West Australia, Queensland and Tasmania. Now at that stage, only men had the vote. Let's not forget that. And Aboriginal people didn't have any political input. In the first round of referendums in 1898, the Constitution was adopted in every state except New South Wales. Some alterations were made. The referendum was re-held. The referendum was re-held, and what happened is that the people of West Australia decided, the government of West Australia decided there was no point participating because they've already adopted the Constitution of Australia, which has been put to them. In 1900, the bill was put to the Australian Parliament, and at that particular stage, only 5 states were interested: New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Queensland, South Australia and West Australia. The people of West Australia at that stage had refused to be incorporated into this new federal structure. On the 7th of July 1900, the bill was passed by both houses of the British Parliament. On the 9th of July 1900, it obtained royal assent from Queen Victoria, who was still alive and well. And on the 17th of September, it was proclaimed. And the Federation started on the 1st of January 1901. Now, West Australia, at a late stage, after the bill had been passed in the British Parliament, asked to be incorporated in the new Federation of Australia as one of the 6 original states. So what is the Australian Constitution? What is the Constitution of Australia? What does the document entail? The document is broken up into 128 sections in 8 different chapters. The first chapter is the legislative chapter, which sets out the mechanism via which laws are made, setting up the House of Representatives, the Senate, and Section 7 and Section 4. Section 7 pertains to the Senate and Section 4 pertains to the House of Representatives, states that the representatives will be directly chosen by the people. Directly chosen by the people, but it doesn't define who the people are. That definition is left up to the federal parliament, and it wasn't until 1902 that all women were able to vote, and it wasn't until after 1967 that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders had the right to vote, although some had been enrolled in the various states before that. So that's the first section. The second section is the executive. Now, the executive role of government is to ensure that the laws that are made are carried out. And originally, it was the Governor-General, the Queen's representative in this country, that had the sole power to appoint the executive. But today, the executive is appointed by the Prime Minister and Cabinet. That's why the Prime Minister and Cabinet are the only people able to declare war. Then we have the judiciary, and a federal and a high court was established. A high court was established to actually interpret these 128 sections of the Constitution. Now, the interesting thing about the Australian Constitution is not just what is written in those 128 segments. There's also unwritten conventions based on the Westminster system. Unwritten conventions regarding things like responsible government. So in many regards, although the Constitution is important, these unwritten conventions are also important when the High Court attempts to interpret constitutional questions which are brought to it on a regular basis. So that's the judiciary. So that's the three first sections. The next section is really an exceptionally important section of the Australian Constitution. It's about finance and trade. One of the main reasons that business leaders and people in authority wanted a federation without a Bill of Rights was to create an Australian common market between the 6 states. What that meant is the tariffs which existed, which could be imposed on goods between states, were removed, and free trade between the states was one of the founding sections of the Constitution, which is found in the finance and trade section. It was based on this concept of not having tariffs and not having protectionist measures where one state protected its workforce against another state. So it was an anti-protectionist mechanism, and it was an anti-tariff mechanism. We all know, those are familiar with Australian history, the ridiculous situation where the different states had different railway gauges, and if you wanted to go from Sydney to Melbourne, you had to get off at Albury to get on a different train because of a different gauge. The next section is about the states. And during COVID-19, the embargoes that occurred during COVID-19, it's important to understand how strong the states are. They have their own constitution, their own parliament. The Australian Constitution is a federation of states. They have particularly powerful elements within society. They're so powerful that in the Senate, the House of Review, every state, despite its population, say 7 million in New South Wales and 500,000 in Tasmania, has 12 senators in the Senate. And that's to ensure that the interests of the states, are just as important as the interests of the federal government. And the states have extraordinary powers. Then you've got a mechanism by which to create new states. You have a miscellaneous section, and you have a section on how to change the Constitution, which has become important today, as we haven't had a referendum since 1999, since the failed constitutional Republican referendum, that people don't seem to understand. For a question to pass in a referendum, and only the government of the day has the power to put a question to the Australian people, you need a majority in the states and you need a majority in the population at large. Now, although we've had 44 referendums since Federation, only 8 have been successful and 3 in 1 year in 1977. And I'll go through these 8 changes because they're important. Well, 3 of them are, or maybe 2. In 1906, a referendum was held to tidy up representation as far as the Senate was concerned. That was successful. In 1910, the next successful referendum revolved around the Commonwealth taking over state debt, if, asked to by the state. The third referendum that was successful was in 1926, which was again passed by the Australian people, and that referendum allowed the state to take on the federal government to take over new state debt, not just the original state debt, but new state debt. And the next successful referendum, I think the most successful of all, was in 1946, where after people had sacrificed themselves during World War II with over 25,000 Australian dead, people demanded more. And the 1946 Constitution expanded the power of the federal government to provide social security benefits. Before 1946, they only had power as far as disability pensions were concerned and old age pensions. The 1946 successful referendum allowed the Commonwealth government to legislate in terms of maternity allowances, widows' pensions, sickness benefits, unemployment benefits, and the list goes on and on. Hospitals, dental services. This was the payback that people expected after the sacrifices they've made during World War II. The next successful referendum was, in terms of numbers, the most successful, the 1967 referendum, which many people think revolved around giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders the vote. This was not the central question. The central question in the referendum was based on section 51, subsection, I think, 26. And that question was that the original Constitution stated that the Commonwealth had the power to make special laws regarding specific races in the community, except Aboriginals in any state, in every state. So that what that meant was, till 1967, the federal government had no power to make special laws regarding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And the passage of that legislation allowed it to make special laws instead in terms of land rights, which were granted in the Northern Territory by the Whitlam Labor government a few years later. It allowed resources, federal resources, be used as far as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander projects and services were concerned. Health, legal aid, and the list goes on and on. But importantly, it wasn't that section which was removed from the Constitution. What was removed was section 127. We now only have 128 sections, and that was about not counting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the national census. As far as section 51, subsection 31 is concerned, the only thing that changed was that, except for Aboriginals in every state, was removed, but the power of the Commonwealth government to make special laws as deemed necessary regarding different racial groups in Australia continues to be present. So you could make a law to stop a particular racial group from voting. You can make many of these laws. That's something interesting. The next successful referendums, and there were 3 of them, was in 1977, where when the Whitlam Labor government was dismissed in 1975, there was a great deal of anger and debate regarding the powers of the Governor-General, because the power of the Governor-General are not specifically outlined in the Constitution. They're called reserve powers. And a lot of the Westminster edition relies on conventions. And it was a convention that if a senator resigned, the state that senator came from, the government in that state would appoint a senator from the same political party. Now, the deadlock occurred in the Senate because the Premier of New South Wales refused to appoint a Labor senator for a retiring Labor senator. So that convention was broken. The second convention was broken was by Mr. Whitlam. When a Prime Minister cannot receive a majority in Parliament, in the House of Representatives, they either need to resign or call a fresh election. Now Whitlam decided to do neither and hang in there. So the reality is there are all these unwritten conventions. Now in 1986 was again a very important act, the Australia Act, which was passed by the Hawke-Keating government. Before 1986, theoretically, the British Parliament had the power to intervene in the Australian Parliament, because that power was inherent in the Australian Constitution. And we saw an example of this in 1917 when Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister of the date, after losing the conscription plebiscite in 1916, asked the British government to extend his tenure as Prime Minister and his government's tenure. Fortunately, this didn't need to occur because the Senate blocked that legislation, but the British government had agreed. Interestingly, in 1933, the people of West Australia voted to secede from Australia. The Australian Parliament refused to accept that because there was an appeal under the Constitution to the Privy Council, which is Britain's highest court, the House of Lords and the Commons. The people of West Australia appealed to the British government to pass legislation to allow West Australia to secede from Australia. In 1931, a piece of law called the Statute of Westminster was passed in the British Parliament, which decreased the British Parliament's power to intervene in the affairs of their colonies. And so they rejected this move. So it wasn't until 1986 that appeals to the Privy Council were abolished during the Australia Act. Now let's look at freedoms. Do we have freedom of speech? No. The High Court found, because of Section 7 and 24, that Parliament is directly chosen by the people, there is a guarantee of political speech during the electoral process, just during the electoral process. And there also a guarantee of freedom from interference in elections. The High Court has never used the word right or implied right. It's either freedoms or guarantees. There are only 4 guarantees in the Australian Constitution. No guarantee to the right to strike, no right to strike, no right to free speech, no right to free association, no right to freedom of movement, and the list goes on and on. There are only 4 minuscule rights. 4. Section 116 gives people indirectly the right to religious freedom, because under the Constitution the federal government or the Commonwealth cannot pass legislation regarding making a national religion or people taking a religious oath to take office. So there is an indirect freedom of religious observance. Under Section 117, you can't discriminate against somebody because of the state they live in. You can't discriminate based on the state they live in. Then I think it's Section 80 or it could be 51, which gives you the right to fair compensation if your property is acquired by the Commonwealth. Not under state legislation, but Commonwealth legislation. So very, very few freedoms. Very few indeed. Now, if you want further information regarding the Australian Constitution, I suggest you go to another YouTube channel, josephtoscano.nam, N-A-A-R-M. In that particular lecture, I talk about in greater depth about the Australian Constitution, but the concept, the ending is, we don't have any constitutional freedoms. We don't have any Bill of Rights. We do have the right to trial by jury for indictable offence. We do have the right to just compensation if the Commonwealth acquires our property. We do have the right not to be discriminated against because of the state we live in. And we do have a right to pursue our particular religious beliefs. But that's it. Nothing else constitutionally. The High Court has to find an implied guarantee or freedom in the Constitution for you to enjoy.